Blueprint for an Ecological Civilization. Land care as a path to wholeness in an era of ecological collapse. Episode 2, Land Acknowledgment. Written and narrated by Stephen Leslie. Right now, a whole lot of people everywhere on the planet are waking up to, or are already fully experiencing with every fiber of their being, the reality of abrupt, irreversible climate change. Woken up to the fact that we are in an ecological apocalypse. The predicament we face is systemic and global. Any abiding solutions must begin at the grassroots. That's always where the real and dynamic change begins. The predicament we face is not just climate change, nor loss of biodiversity, nor ecological collapse. As terrible as these unfolding disasters are, they are not root causes, but rather symptoms of the macro-systemic problem of planetary overshoot. In the simplest of terms, human beings are a species that is exceeding the carrying capacity of our global habitat. We are consuming raw materials faster than ecosystems can replace them, and we are contaminating the water, air, and soil with pollutants at a rate far beyond their capacity to be broken down and recycled. According to the organizers behind Planetary Overshoot Day, the global civilization used up its annual allotment of sustainable resources on July 25th of 2025. Current estimates put our annual global consumption of resources at 1.8 planet Earths. We are using up almost two whole planets' worth of resources to sustain our endless industrial growth economies. The US represents about 5% of the global population, but consumes 20% of its resources. These days, even in the scientific community, the planetary being we all occupy is often referred to as Gaia, the ancestral mother of all creation. This was the term coined by the independent scientist, inventor, and professor James Lovelock, who named our world after an ancient Greek goddess when he posited his hypotheses that any planet capable of sustaining life will of necessity have a capacity for self-regulation. Lovelock began his studies for NASA, defining a criteria for discovering life on exoplanets. As he delved deeply into the science, he discovered that there's an inexplicable governor that stabilizes a myriad of competing factors influencing the climate on Earth, by which the planet is able to maintain homeostasis. The driver is, in effect, life itself. This explains, for example, how for the last 10,000 years of the Holocene era, the global environment has existed in a Goldilocks zone, within which life as we know it has thrived. This discovery also gave him deeper insight into how human activity is destabilizing this innate global capacity to sustain equilibrium. In our globalized civilization of today, it is indigenous people who still retain a vital connection to the planet as a living being. Indigenous and traditional people have been experiencing the ecological apocalypse brought about as a consequence of settler colonialism for more than 500 years. Through tenacity, creativity, and resilience, Indigenous people continue to resist colonization and its neoliberal successor, globalism. According to the United Nations Council on Biodiversity, 80% of the biodiversity remaining on Earth is on lands under the caretakership of indigenous people, who make up about 5% of the human population and occupy just 22% of the planet's terrestrial surface. In spite of enduring centuries of genocide and oppression, many teachers and healers within these communities freely share their ceremonies, wisdom teachings, and practical knowledge of land caretaking, guiding all members of the global family. They welcome all who have been cut off from their roots, but who are thirsty to reconnect and to learn, generously guiding all who will listen to find a path back to right relationship with the natural world, a path to a sane present and a livable future. In this time of climate crisis, we who are challenging the destructive paradigms of the dominant culture shouldn't offer indigenous people a place at the table. We should step aside and make space for them to lead. Honoring and uplifting the role of indigenous peoples is not only a necessary act of historical justice, but also a vital strategy to guarantee a sustainable and equitable future for all people and for all other life forms. If those of us who are born of the dominant culture listen to indigenous and traditional people, what kind of new economy might we dream of? What sane new country might we find a path to? Imagine what humanity might accomplish if we put our current scientific and technological prowess to the task of repairing every ecosystem. What if all our collective knowledge as a species, ancient and of the moment, were applied and guided by an ethic of gratitude and reciprocity? These days, it has become quite common for symposiums held at places such as universities and libraries, church groups, or seminars presented by NGOs to pronounce a land acknowledgement at the onset of the proceedings. The ritual of pronouncing a land acknowledgement before meetings seems to have several origin stories. Some hold that it arose in the 1990s, during a period of time when the Australian government convened a Council of Truth and Reconciliation process with the Aboriginal people. It was first promoted by Aboriginal political groups in the form of a Welcome to Country ceremony. The movement quickly took root in neighboring New Zealand, a nation also coming to terms with the tremendous trauma and suffering inflicted upon the Maori people since the beginning of British colonization. The adoption of the practice of land acknowledgement was also promoted as a result of the Canadian government's Truth and Reconciliation Commission, active between 2008 to 2015, that sought to document the painful history and lasting impacts of the Canadian Indian residential school system upon First Nation children and families. These government-sponsored institutions operated for over 100 years in both the US and Canada. Indigenous children were kidnapped, their braids were cut, and they were dressed in a school uniform, forced to abandon their spiritual beliefs and practices, adopt Christianity, and only ever speak in English. Students were underfed, received shoddy medical treatment, and were regularly beaten, as well as subject to psychological and sexual abuse. The Canadian Truth and Reconciliation Commission drafted a call for action with 92 recommendations. Education of the public is a prominent feature of this program, and the widespread adoption of land acknowledgements is one of many outcomes of those efforts aimed at repairing relations with First Nations and improving their quality of life. It is estimated that 20% of Native Americans in the US live at or below the poverty line compared to a national average of 11%. In general terms, and not discounting insightful criticism from academics and activists within Indigenous communities, the land acknowledgement movement seems to be yielding some positive results. It has been welcomed by many Indigenous groups for the simple fact that it gets people of the dominant culture to recognize that Indigenous people still exist and to encourage them to be curious about the specific history of the places they are in. But there is the danger of the ritual of the acknowledgement becoming a perfunctory formula, devoid of the deep time awareness and future intentionality it is designed to instigate. An older story is that this practice echoes the manner in which indigenous people traveling outside of their home territories would address their hosts. This self-introduction would include one's name, one's clan, and the territory to which they belonged. Person, community, and land would all be presented as tied together in a single bundle, and those receiving the guest would thereby understand who they were and where they were coming from. This kind of self-declaration would be impossible for most people today, who in the homogeneity of the American melting pot have been cut off from their cultural roots, language, and places of origin. Most of us are at a fundamental level displaced persons. Many land acknowledgments reference the thousands of years of good stewardship practiced by Native people. Less often is the current woeful and degraded state of the environment fully acknowledged. Until we come to terms with how disastrous have been the results of European occupation upon the ecological integrity of this continent, we won't have any hope of mobilizing ourselves to take on the urgent and necessary work of habitat reclamation. Pronouncing a verbal land acknowledgement is an important first step. But once we have done that, we need to fully commit ourselves to being part of healing and the restoration of the land where we now live, as well as of her original inhabitants. We need truth and reconciliation, not only with people, but with the land itself. We need to declare a moratorium on development. From here on, let progress be measured by the degree of restoration and the reclamation of wild nature that we can achieve. All of us who are committed to climate activism and earth repair have an obligation and a tremendous opportunity to let our movement be informed at every level by the resilience, resistance, wisdom heart, and traditional knowledge of the original inhabitants of Turtle Island. The current polycrisis we face present us with a watershed moment to put the welfare of the biosphere front and center of all policy change and all government spending. The roots of all social injustice are bound up with the exploitation of land, water, and air. The colonial capitalist system that historically and currently inflicts so much cruelty upon indigenous people and people of color is the same system that exploits and degrades the natural world. Reparations to one without the other will be meaningless. If we, as a global civilization, can recalibrate our technology to align with ecological reality, integrate the indigenous worldview of relationality and reciprocity, set our sights on living within global limits, truly commit to social justice and equity for all citizens in a world where none are denominated illegal, honor the right of all living beings to have their existence. If we can do all these things, then we may just have a chance of charting a path through climate chaos to a new and more highly evolved epoch in which humans assume our rightful place as a beneficial keystone species. In this new era, every member of the human family needs to wake up and remember that we are all indigenous to this planet. Doing so should not in any way undermine the legitimate claims of recognition and reparation due to First Nation, Indigenous, and traditional peoples devastated by the ongoing legacy of colonialism. It simply means that now is the time for all of us to forge a new old way of life that returns the human community to right relationship with all other living beings and in balance with the environment. After all, every living being is indigenous to Mother Earth. The dominant society occupies indigenous lands. We must acknowledge this history and reality with all its tragic implications for the people, the wildlife, and the ecosystems of our region. Vermont can become a leader in the land back movement, sometimes referred to as rematriation. This is an idea that has been around a long while, but it really began to gain traction in the US in 2016 with the occupation encampment established at Standing Rock in protest of the Dakota Access Pipeline. Tribal members from all across the country and globally joined ranks and invited allies to stand up against the fossil carbon oligarchy. Then, in July of 2020, the pan-Indigenous NDN Collective led a protest march on the occasion of President Donald J. Trump delivering a speech at Mount Rushmore. Recently, he has been hinting that he wants his effigy to join the colossal carvings on the side of the mountain. One of the outcomes of this protest was the drafting of a Land Back Manifesto, which calls for the return of everything stolen from Indigenous people. The global land back movement is not looking to privatize public lands. As Indigenous communities did not own land in the Western legal sense of the term, but rather different peoples had traditional community caretakership rights to specific territories. What they now seek is to have public lands returned to Indigenous collective management. Currently, the national park system comprises 84 million acres of land that was taken from Indigenous people, as happened with Yosemite in California. In the course of establishing the new park, President Teddy Roosevelt and John Muir oversaw the displacement of the Miwok people, whose ancestors had lived in the valley for 7,000 years. When the national and state park systems were set up, the idea was that wilderness areas would be preserved by leaving them untouched, and natural resource areas would be held in reserve as multi-use for granting commercial leases to forestry, grazing, mining, and fossil carbon extraction interests. The concept of removing human beings from the landscape is foreign to Indigenous worldview, who understand themselves to be active agents of ecological stewardship in the places where they currently live or where they once lived, including the national parks from which their ancestors were displaced. It is estimated that since the onset of settlement, Indigenous people in the U.S. have been displaced from 99% of their territory. Indigenous communities were officially banned under the 1883 Code of Indian Offenses, by which the federal government, as part of a wider effort to dismantle traditional life ways, forced assimilation into white culture. Under the auspices of the Dawes Act of 1887, the federal government stole an additional 90 million acres, undermining the original reservation system by implementing a policy of allocating individual allotments aimed at breaking up collectively held tribal lands. Once the allotments were granted, the remaining reservation land could be sold off to whites, and individual allotments could be sold or leased. On the bright side, since its inception, the land back movement has seen a number of successes in its efforts at reclamation of ancestral lands. In the past 2 decades, at least 100 federally recognized tribes out of the 500 in the U.S. have recovered land from both public and private holdings through various legal mechanisms, returning more than 3 million acres to indigenous communities. For instance, in 2022, by partnering with a land trust, the Boyce Fort Band of Chippewa nearly doubled the amount of land owned by the tribe of 3,600 members in the Northwoods of Minnesota. This has returned some of the most productive wild rice stands in the state back under the care of the Chippewa, who recognize the rice as a sacred food, making it what anthropologists refer to as a cultural keystone species. This kind of success within the land back movement is not only healing and restorative for indigenous peoples' cultural health and physical well-being, but also for the descendants of colonial settlers, and ultimately it benefits all beings. The deeper meaning and purpose underlying the ceremony of land acknowledgement is fulfilled when it serves as a gateway to participation in the land back movement. The four state recognized bands of the Western Abenaki people, who are indigenous to the bioregion we now call Vermont, which comprises the territory between the Champlain Basin to the west and the Connecticut River watershed to the east, ought to have a just measure of public lands returned to their tenure. For those of us who are caretaking land with agroecological practices, everything we do is a land acknowledgement. Even if we aren't in a position to return land directly back to indigenous communities, we can step up as engaged allies in the cause, and we can give the land under our care back to wild nature. May all policymakers, globally and on a local scale, seek now the guidance of indigenous leaders as society charts new pathways toward an ecological civilization. We need to commit to aligning our technologies and practices to a new land ethic that respects ancient ways. Corn, squash, and beans are making a comeback. Once we set about to heal the land will heal us. Every human being is a child of Earth. Each one of us has the memory in our DNA of what it means to be a part of the whole. Welcome home.